When I was a child, I don't think I was even in kindergarten yet, I lived with my grandparents. My mom and dad separated, and my dad had a contract for work in the next town over, which wasn't too far away, so I got to see him on weekends. My uncle, who was my dad's brother, also lived at the house, so I was rarely ever left home alone at such a young age. I was taught never to answer the door for strangers if I was home alone. I grew up in a small town, and it was relatively peaceful, and everyone knew everyone's name. I remember that we had a neighbor who would visit regularly. He came to watch Hockey Night in Canada, WWF, family barbecues, and that kind of stuff. I can't remember his name, so I'll refer to him as David. David was friends with both my grandpa and my uncle. He'd drink beers with my uncle while watching hockey, and he'd help my grandpa out with the yard and work on the truck. On nights when my grandpa came back from hunting, if he caught a moose, they'd unload it from the back of my grandpa's truck into the shed. One night I was left home alone. It wasn't for very long at all. Grandma was at bingo and called Grandpa for a pickup. Grandpa told me he was going to pick up Grandma and asked me if I wanted to come along for the ride. I was watching cartoons, so I didn't want to go. So he told me that he'd be right back and reminded me not to unlock the door for strangers. I remember hearing the truck start up, and I saw the headlights pull out of the driveway onto the road, and then he was gone. Not even a few minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. I ran up to the front of the house and yelled, "Who is it?"
"It's David,"
the familiar voice said. "Grandpa and Grandma aren't home right now," I said through the door.
"Yeah, I just saw your grandpa's truck drive away."
"My uncle isn't home either," I said.
"I know. I was speaking to him on the phone. He's at another buddy's house drinking beer. Can I come in?"
David replied. "I'm not allowed to open the door for strangers," I told him.
"I'm not a stranger. I'm your neighbor. You know me. Let me in."
He was right, I thought. I did know him, and he was a family friend. He literally lived next door. It didn't occur to me at the time why he would want to come and visit while my uncle and grandpa weren't home. I proceeded to unlock the door and open it for David. I remember seeing him towering over me as I looked up. He was drunk. I could tell by the way he talked and how his upper body was swaying side to side. He was squinting with one eye. He took one step in, and I moved back quickly, not wanting my feet to get stepped on. He put his hands on my shoulders. There weren't any alarms going off in my head yet. I had seen my uncle drunk before. I told him to come in, and he could wait in the kitchen if he wanted, and I was going to go back to watch TV. He wouldn't let go of my shoulders, though. I tried grabbing onto one of his hands in an attempt to free myself from his grip. It was futile. I can't remember what he was saying to me, but I just remember hearing the anger in his voice and the fear inside me after hearing him speak. He dragged me into the kitchen and grabbed a big knife. He asked me if I wanted to get stabbed as he poked me with the knife on my belly. I started to cry out in fear. He told me to shut up, or he'd cut out my tongue or slice my throat. I remember feeling the cold steel of the knife as he used the other side of it to fake slice my throat, as if to show me or prove that he wasn't kidding. The next thing I remember was hearing the sound of the truck pulling in, the engine turning off, and the doors of the truck opening and closing. I felt a moment of relief as I knew rescue was seconds away. I was just about to holler for help when he put his hand over my mouth to prevent me from screaming. He turned us both towards the door, and I remember seeing the door open and my grandma entering the house. Her smile quickly faded when she saw David was holding me hostage with a knife. She screamed for my grandpa to get the hell inside right now. My grandpa was always a big and strong man. He rushed in, and I remember hearing his booming voice.
"What the hell is going on in here?"
He looked at David, still holding me hostage. I remember that I could see the rage and hate in my grandpa's eyes as I realized the situation. His voice was still booming.
"What the fuck do you think you're doing?"
as he advanced towards David. He was in full attack mode. David pushed me to the floor, and my grandma rushed over and grabbed me so tight that I couldn't see what was happening. She was comforting me and told me that I was safe. I could still hear the commotion in the kitchen. A struggle was happening. I don't remember who was saying what. All I remember is my grandpa was victorious. I was finally able to look up as he shoved David out the door.
Never come back here again, you son of a bitch.
And he slammed the door shut. David knew I was home alone, and he waited for that moment when he saw my grandpa's truck pull away. He knew my uncle wasn't home, and probably asked if my grandma was at bingo that night as well. With this knowledge, and seeing my grandpa's truck drive away with only my grandpa in it, he knew it was his opportunity to do whatever he had planned. Or maybe he didn't even have a plan. I don't really know what his motives were. I was just a young boy. After my grandpa's funeral, after I was done with high school, I was sitting at the table with my grandma, exchanging stories about Grandpa. I brought up this moment with my grandma, remembering the hero that he was that night. She looked a little nervous as I recalled the story. She said it was a very scary night. She asked if I remembered that he went out hunting that night. I vaguely remember, but it wasn't something that he usually did unless he was going camping or something. I asked why she told me that, but she didn't remember much. It got me thinking. They never called the cops to press charges on David, and I never saw him again after that. My grandpa was respected in the community. He was friends with, as well as went to church with, some of the police officers, and they all knew him to be a good hunter. No one would ever question him if they saw a bloody tarp in the back of his truck while he was driving out of town late at night. During the early years of my first marriage, my then husband Daniel and I lived in a small apartment. There were 3 floors in total, plus a basement. The basement was a dreary and dreadful place, with a serious rat and mouse problem. I had only been down there once out of curiosity. The only reason anyone else would go down there was to tend to the furnace or the fuse box. It would have been nice if they would clean the place up and put a laundry room down there, but that never happened. We used a laundromat down the street. It wasn't the most glamorous place, but it was good enough while we were getting our careers in order. Daniel was a recent graduate from the accounting program at a local community college, and he just landed his first job. It was a big step for us, even though the money wasn't great. I, on the other hand, was finishing up an internship in a physical therapy program. Dan was very calm and serious. He spoke with purpose and never minced words. He carried himself with a stoic intensity that I've never seen in anyone before or since. Once you get past his tough outer shell, though, he was a really sweet and caring guy. It's safe to say that I was head over heels for him, and he felt the same for me, so I thought anyway. Our apartment was on the 2nd floor, and we had a few neighbors, most of whom we didn't even know. The other tenants on our floor kept to themselves for the most part, and they were all very quiet. The only exception was our upstairs neighbor, and they fought often. Nothing physical as far as we knew, but verbal arguments were frequent. Their names were Claude and Celia. Claude was older, 35 if I had to guess, and Celia was probably my age, which was 23. We would pass in the hall and exchange small talk now and then, but our conversations never went far below the surface. Maybe that's because I was afraid the fighting would come up, and I didn't want to get into that. We never bothered to complain about them, even though the noise was quite a nuisance. It just didn't seem like our place, although looking back, I know that we should have done something. The walls were thin enough that we could hear even light conversation, but we usually couldn't make out any actual words. It was just always muffled. It seemed like once or twice a week, we would wake up to yelling from upstairs. Because of that, we weren't alarmed when one night the shrill sound of a woman's scream pierced our ears. Daniel and I jumped up in unison from our sleeping positions in bed. I thought it was the fire alarm at first, but when I came to, I realized it was another fight from the couple upstairs. We had listened to dozens of fights by then, but this one was different. The screaming was on another level, but strangely, It seemed very one-sided. Celia was screaming, but Claude was very calm. It seemed like he was trying to defuse the situation. I could only tell that from the tone, because I couldn't understand most of the words. At one point, I almost called the police, but Daniel stopped me. "It's not our place. Just go back to sleep," he said calmly. "How can I go back to sleep? Do you hear this?" I shot back. "Listen, we've heard all this before. Just let it go," he added. I didn't like his tone, but I backed down reluctantly. The yelling continued for several more minutes. Then we heard a loud thud and a crash on the floor like someone had just dropped a ton of bricks. After that, nothing but silence. I looked over at Daniel, and he was laying still on his back with his eyes closed. I knew he couldn't be sleeping though, so I said, "Daniel, did you hear that?" "It stopped now. Go back to sleep," he said. I was stunned by his coldness. There was no way he didn't hear what I heard. I got up out of bed and looked around the room for my phone. I couldn't let this go. Before I had a chance to call, I heard police sirens, and they were getting louder. Then I heard the door of our building open, and several people entered, then stomped up the stairs. I figured someone else must have called, so I sat on the end of my bed and buried my head in my hands. After about 30 seconds, I looked over at Daniel, and he was just lying there, seemingly asleep. I couldn't understand how this situation didn't bother him more. I knew he heard what I heard, so how could he be so cold? My attention soon turned back upstairs. I could hear that others had entered the place upstairs, and as soon as they did, the woman's screams started again. It was Celia, and that must have meant that Claude was the one who was hurt. I also found it odd that the screaming only started again when the police or paramedics arrived, or whoever it was. I then got up and looked out the window. There was an ambulance parked in front of the building. The flashing lights were still on, and I noticed a stretcher being wheeled out to the back of the ambulance. I'll never forget what I saw on the stretcher. It was Claude, and he was badly beaten. I couldn't understand how he looked so bad. At that moment, however, I didn't know what was more disturbing, the event itself, or Daniel's indifference. To me, it was crystal clear that we had just witnessed a crime. I didn't feel comfortable sleeping in my own bed that night, so I went out to the living room and tried to sleep on the couch. I must have drifted off at some point, because I remember waking up in the morning. Daniel was sitting on the chair in front of the couch. He was looking at me, as if he was waiting for me to wake up. His legs and arms were crossed, and there was a serious look on his face. I sat up on the couch and looked at him, then he said, "I don't know what you think you heard last night, but if anyone asks, we were asleep." "What? I heard it all. Why would I say that?" I asked. "It's just not our place to get involved," he added. His expression was very serious and cold. I was beyond creeped out at this point. There was something going on with Daniel, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I agreed not to tell what I'd heard that night, but I couldn't understand why. I was so suspicious of Daniel that I had to dig deeper. Later that night, I decided to go through his phone. While he was in the shower after work, I took it out of his pocket. It was password protected, but I knew the code, so I entered it and started snooping. It wasn't long before I found messages between him and Celia. They were having an affair. It was all in plain sight, but I didn't see it. I moved out of the apartment immediately and stayed with my parents for a while, and we divorced soon after. I found out later that Claude died, and it was ruled an accident, but I don't believe it. I think Celia murdered him, and Daniel had something to do with it. Even though I can't prove anything, that's the only thing that makes sense. If that's true, and they conspired to kill Claude, then was I next?